Imagine, just for a second, that you're in the absolute depths of grief.
Right. Just the worst possible headspace.
Exactly. You are completely exhausted. Your entire world has just been turned upside down,
Mm.
and your brain feels like it's just operating through this thick fog.
Yeah, totally.
And then suddenly, a clock starts ticking.
Oh, the pressure.
You are handed this super strict deadline, and you are tasked with summarizing an entire complex human life in like just a few short paragraphs.
Which is, I mean, it's terrifying.
It is. It is without a doubt one of the most daunting writing assignments anyone can face.
Because you're being asked to capture, decades of memories, all these intricate personality quirks, complicated family history.
While grieving.
Right, all while navigating the logistical nightmare of, planning a service. The emotional and cognitive load is just staggering.
It really is.
Most people just sit down at their computer, they stare at a blinking cursor, and they feel completely, absolutely paralyzed.
And the reality is almost all of us will have to face that blinking cursor at some point, right?
Unfortunately, yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive is to completely demystify this high-stakes, super emotionally heavy task.
Mm-hmm.
We want to take writing an obituary and basically transform it from this dreaded, intimidating obligation into a manageable and honestly a deeply meaningful process.
Which we desperately need a roadmap for because, let's be honest, nobody teaches you how to write an obituary until you absolutely have to write one.
No, not at all.
It's a genre of writing we literally only engage with during, the worst weeks of our lives.
Yeah. So to give us that roadmap, we're relying on a single, just phenomenal source today. It's this highly practical, step-by-step guide from Vigils, and it's simply titled How to Write an Obituary.
Super straightforward.
And it's grounded, it's compassionate, and it really just strips away all the intimidation factor. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, and I think the very first thing the guide does to relieve that pressure is to redefine what an obituary actually is. Because we often go into this thinking we need to write this soaring literary masterpiece.
And some heartbreaking epic poem.
Exactly. But an obituary is fundamentally just a warm past tense short biography. And there is a really crucial distinction the guide makes right up front, which is you are speaking about the person, not to them.
Which is hard.
Yeah.
Because when you're grieving, I feel like the immediate instinct is to write a letter to the person you just lost.
Oh, absolutely.
You want to write like, Mom, we will miss you so much, or you were the best dad.
Yeah.
But the guide specifically warns against this. Speaking in the third person about them, rather than to them, it helps maintain this necessary structure.
It really does.
It allows you to fulfill the historical function of the document while still, infusing it with warmth.
Yeah.
You aren't writing a private journal entry here. You are writing a public announcement.
And setting that boundary instantly makes the whole task feel less overwhelming. You're a narrator, right? Not a correspondent.
Yeah.
And as a narrator, your job is simply to be clear and honest.
So to help build that narrative, the guide essentially splits the anatomy of an obituary into two kind of conflicting buckets. Instead of just walking through a dry checklist of requirements, we can look at this as a balance between the historical record and the human narrative.
I love that framing.
Right. So the historical record includes the rigid facts, the full legal name, the birth and death dates, the cities they lived in, the list of surviving family members, and obviously the practical service details for the funeral.
Yeah, and those elements are the architectural foundation. And precision here is incredibly important for the community.
Oh, for sure.
Take the name, for example. The guide insists on including the full legal name, maiden names in parentheses, and crucially, the name everyone actually called them.
Which is huge.
Yeah, the example they use is Margaret Ellen Calloway, née Walsh, known to everyone as Peggy.
Because if everyone in town knew her as Peggy and you only publish a formal notice for Margaret Ellen...
They're going to miss it.
Right. People scanning the local paper might genuinely miss the announcement entirely. You are basically putting out a homing beacon for anyone who ever crossed paths with this person.
Exactly.
And if you leave out the maiden name, you might lose the high school friend from 40 years ago who only knew, Peggy Walsh.
Yeah, so that historical record roots the document in reality. It provides the who, what, where, and when.
Right.
But once you have that scaffolding in place, then you have to transition into the second bucket, which is the human narrative.
The actual story.
Exactly. The brief life story, where they worked, what they loved, how they spent their time. And the guide highlights two main structural approaches to organizing this narrative: the chronological and the thematic.
Okay, so the chronological structure is exactly what it sounds like. You start at birth, you move through their life in order, and you end at their death and legacy.
Very standard.
Yeah. If we think about this in cinematic terms, it's like a standard documentary film. The timeline is the spine of the story. You trace the arc from start to finish, birthplace, education, marriage, career, retirement.
And it works perfectly for someone who had a very defined linear trajectory.
Sure.
A clear career path they built over decades, a family they raised step by step. The calendar just makes sense as the organizing principle there.
But then you have the thematic structure. This is where you lead with who they were, their personality, what they loved, what made them memorable, and you kind of weave the chronological facts in around those traits.
Right.
If chronological is a standard documentary, thematic feels way more like an indie character study.
That's a great way to put it.
But, and let me push back on this for a second. If you're sitting at your kitchen table trying to draft this, isn't the thematic structure just inherently disorganized?
Well,
Like if we were skipping around a timeline, completely ignoring the natural progression of a life, doesn't it defeat the entire purpose of a biography?
what's fascinating here is that we so often conflate a person's life story with their resume.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But for many people, their defining impact on the world wasn't, a linear progression of jobs or moving from city to city. It was their character.
Okay.
A thematic structure really serves people whose lives were defined by their passions, their humor, or maybe their community presence far more than their actual career milestones.
So you're organizing by impact, not by the calendar.
Exactly. Consider someone who is known primarily as, like, a fiercely loyal friend and a chaotic but brilliant amateur artist who changed careers 5 different times.
Right, a resume approach wouldn't work at all.
Exactly. Starting their obituary with their birth in 1952 in Ohio completely buries the lead. It doesn't capture their essence.
Yeah, nobody cares about 1952 Ohio if they were this wild artist.
Right. Leading with their vibrant personality, maybe sharing a story about how they saw art in absolutely everything, that is actually a much more accurate biography of their spirit. You can weave the dates and the cities in later, but the theme is the anchor.
That framing completely changes how you approach the blank page.
Oh.
You don't have to force a wildly colorful life into a rigid chronological box.
Not at all.
So we have our structure. We understand the balance of the historical record and the human narrative. But how do we prevent this from sounding like a generic form letter?
Yes, the form letter problem.
Because we have all read those obituaries that sound like they were literally produced by a fill-in-the-blank software.
Yeah, which brings us to the actual craft of writing. How do you inject the soul of the person into these words, especially when you are operating under that ticking clock we talked about?
Well, the guide has some brilliant, highly actionable advice for this. And the first tip is unbelievably simple, but it changes the entire psychological feel of the text.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one.
Use their name, not just pronouns. The guide points out that writing "David loved the Giants" lands entirely differently than writing "He loved the Giants."
It really does, because every time you read the name, it brings the specific person right back into the room. Pronouns create distance. They make the writing feel abstract and kind of detached. The repetition of the name acts as a psychological anchor.
Right.
It forces the reader to constantly connect the traits being described directly to the individual they actually knew.
My absolute favorite piece of advice in this entire guide, though, is what I'll call the one specific detail rule.
Oh, yes.
The guide urges you to completely bypass paragraphs of broad generalities about, how nice or hardworking someone was.
Which everyone says.
Right. And instead focus on concrete things. Write about the garden she meticulously kept every single summer, or the chipped coffee mug he absolutely refused to replace.
It's the old writing adage of show, don't tell, but applied to grief.
Exactly.
We remember people through hyper-specific sensory details, not broad adjectives.
It's like a painter using one single, incredibly bright streak of color to make an entire portrait pop. You don't need to paint every single leaf on the tree if you get the color of the trunk exactly right,
Totally.
That one specific detail of the chipped coffee mug does way more heavy lifting to convey a stubborn, comforting personality than a whole page explaining that he was set in his ways.
Yeah, the mug says it all.
But the guide also issues a strict warning about the opposite of specific details, which is cliches.
Right.
They suggest exiling phrases like, passed peacefully, touched many lives, and will be dearly missed, The guide argues these phrases have been used so often they've just become white noise.
They completely strip the individual of their unique humanity.
But look, wait, let me jump in here.
Sure.
I totally get wanting to avoid bad, lazy writing. I do. But if you're the one tasked with writing this, you are actively grieving.
You're exhausted.
Yes. So what if the person did touch many lives? What if they did pass peacefully? Why are we punishing grieving families for reaching for accurate, comforting phrases?
That's a fair question.
Isn't there a reason they became cliches in the first place? They offer a safe harbor when you just don't have the energy to be creative.
They absolutely offer a safe harbor, and you're right, they are almost always rooted in truth. The problem isn't that the phrases are lies. The problem is how the human brain actually processes them.
Okay, how so?
Well, when a reader sees the phrase, touched many lives, their brain glosses right over it.
Oh, right.
It requires zero cognitive engagement because they have seen that exact sequence of words in 1,000 other obituaries. It reduces a vivid, complex, three-dimensional life to just a flat, generic platitude.
So you aren't communicating anything at all, really. You're just filling space.
Precisely. If they touched many lives, you have to tell us how.
The specific detail.
Exactly. Did they touch many lives because they were a high school principal who made a point to remember the name of every single freshman?
Wow, yeah.
Or did they touch lives because they always showed up with a baked ziti when someone in the neighborhood was sick? Give the reader the specific mechanism of their goodness.
I love that, the specific mechanism of their goodness.
Yeah, because that honors the deceased far more than leaning on the cliche, because it forces the reader to actually visualize the impact they had.
So you aren't avoiding the sentiment. You are forcing yourself to prove the sentiment with a real memory. That is incredibly powerful.
It really is.
But doing this kind of deep, specific, evocative writing while your brain is foggy with grief sounds near impossible. I mean, you mentioned the cognitive load earlier,
Yes.
which is exactly why the guide recommends a two-pass approach.
This might actually be the most vital piece of practical advice for anyone staring down this task.
The guide says you should write the first draft quickly, without editing yourself at all.
Just a brain dump.
Exactly. Just get the facts, the random memories, the cities, the specific details out of your head and onto the page. Let it be a complete mess.
Don't worry about spelling or grammar.
Right. Then you step away, you go for a walk, you get some sleep, and you come back for a second pass to revise for tone and structure. Because trying to generate ideas and edit those ideas at the exact same time, especially when you're exhausted from grieving, is a recipe for a total breakdown.
And the neuroscience of grief explains exactly why this happens.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When you are grieving, your brain is flooded with stress hormones. Your prefrontal cortex, which handles executive functions like organization, editing, and critical thinking.
The editing brain.
Exactly. It is severely compromised. You literally cannot ask a grieving brain to engage in fluid emotional memory recall and strict structural editing simultaneously. It just won't work.
So the two-pass method separates the emotional brain dump from the analytical structuring.
Perfectly said. Yes.
Once you've done that second pass and you have a solid draft, they suggest the dinner table test.
I love this test.
You read the draft out loud. If it sounds like a stiff, formal edict from the 1800s, you need to keep revising. But if it sounds like something you would actually say out loud to your friends while sharing a meal and talking about this person, you've nailed it.
It just anchors the tone in genuine, approachable human connection.
But reaching that perfect, specific conversational tribute introduces a massive new hurdle.
Oh, the biggest hurdle.
Because that single writer now has a beautiful draft, and they inevitably have to show it to the rest of the family. And according to the guide, this brings us to the most volatile part of the process.
Because you are suddenly navigating complex family dynamics in the middle of an active crisis.
The guide warns that very few things surface family tensions faster than drafting an obituary. Suddenly, you are dealing with deeply embedded resentments.
Oh, yeah. Who gets mentioned first?
Exactly. Questions arise about who gets mentioned first in the survivor list, whether to acknowledge an estrangement or, how to summarize a life that was maybe very troubled, complicated, or marred by addiction.
Because grief acts as this massive amplifier for existing family friction. Every single word in that document can feel incredibly weighted to different family members.
Like it's the final judgment.
Exactly. It feels like the final definitive statement on a person's life.
So to navigate this absolute minefield, the guide establishes a fundamental rule that you can use to shield yourself. An obituary is a tribute, not a legal document.
Yes, this is so important.
The family has the absolute right to omit painful chapters. You do not have to put every failure, every divorce, or every struggle on the permanent public record.
And this provides immense relief for families who feel this kind of misplaced obligation to tell the whole truth, even when that truth involves deep trauma.
Let me play devil's advocate here, though.
Okay, go for it.
If an obituary is fundamentally a biography, as we established earlier, shouldn't there be a mandate for historical accuracy? Like, if a family deliberately leaves out the painful or complicated chapters of someone's life, aren't they just writing fiction? Aren't we essentially whitewashing history for the sake of comfort?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to examine the sociological function of mourning rituals.
Okay.
An obituary's primary purpose in society is to facilitate communal mourning, right? It's to gather the community for a service and to honor the bonds that tied that person to the living.
Right.
It is not designed to be an objective, sworn historical audit of a person's flaws and failures under penalty of perjury.
A historical audit?
Wow.
Yeah. I guess I've always viewed obituaries as mini biographies, but you're saying they are actually functional tools for communal healing.
Think about it like a wedding toast.
Oh, interesting.
When you give a toast at a wedding, you don't list the couple's worst fights or their financial struggles.
That's
right?
God, no. That would be awful.
Exactly. Even though those are historically accurate parts of their relationship, you focus on their bond and their potential because the purpose of the toast is to bless the union.
That makes so much sense.
An obituary is the closing bookend to our social rituals. Historians and biographers can write the definitive, objective book later if they want to. But the family, in the immediate aftermath of a death, is tasked with creating a narrative that allows the community to grieve safely.
Safely.
Right. Focusing on the light rather than the shadows isn't writing fiction. It's choosing which part of the truth is most necessary for healing in that specific moment.
That reframing is incredible. It totally relieves the writer of the burden of being an impartial judge.
Exactly.
Now, practically speaking, even with that mindset, disagreements will inevitably pop up over wording or inclusions. So to solve this, the guide notes a clear hierarchy of decision-making.
You need a system.
Yeah. The person closest to the deceased, which is usually a spouse or the eldest child, typically gets the final say. You obviously try to reach a consensus, but someone has to be the designated tiebreaker.
Because without a tiebreaker, the process stalls indefinitely.
Right.
And you're on a clock.
Right. Along those lines, they strongly advise designating a single person as the writer, while the rest of the family acts strictly as reviewers.
Writing an obituary by committee is a disaster.
Is like mixing every single color of paint on a palette together. You think you're beautifully capturing everyone's input and representing every viewpoint, but you always just end up with a flat, generic, muddy gray.
Yeah, when a committee writes something, the natural instinct is to compromise by sanding down all the rough edges and specific quirks until all that is left is the safest, most agreeable version possible.
And as we learned with the cliches, generic is the enemy of a meaningful tribute.
Exactly. One distinct voice needs to drive the narrative.
Because that one voice has now written a rich, unedited, sprawling tribute, they're inevitably going to run into a wall when they confront the logistics of publishing. Like, how long should this thing be and where does it actually go?
Right. This introduces what we might call the economics of grief.
The economics of grief, I like that.
Yeah, because the modern landscape of publishing these tributes is deeply fragmented by cost.
Yeah, the guide breaks down 3 different word count benchmarks based on where it is being published. First, you have the death notice. This is strictly the fax name, dates, survivors, service info. It's usually only 50 to 100 words. And there's a very blunt, practical reason for this. Local newspapers charge by the word or the line.
And it is not cheap. Publishing a full-length essay in a major city newspaper can literally cost thousands of dollars.
Thousands.
Oh, yeah. The historical financial barrier birthed the short-form death notice out of pure necessity.
It's like a strict Twitter bio, just
Yeah.
the absolute bare essentials.
Exactly.
Then you have the standard obituary. This sits around 200 to 400 words. It gives you just enough room for that brief life narrative, along with the survivors and service details. This is the typical middle ground for newspapers or online portals. And finally, you have the full memorial obituary. This is 500 to 1,000 words. This is the true character study, the deep dive into their quirks and passions. And this lives almost exclusively online.
Because the internet fundamentally changed how we mourn by removing the financial constraint of physical ink and paper.
Which leads to the guide's golden rule for length. Always write the full, unlimited 1,000-word version first.
Get it all out.
Right. Do not worry about word counts or newspaper fees when you are drafting. Put that beautiful, expansive version on the online memorial page. Let the internet act as an unlimited Wikipedia article for this person's life.
Yeah.
Then, once that emotional work is done, you ruthlessly trim it down, extracting just the hard facts to fit the expensive newspaper requirements.
It allows you to process your grief fully without an invoice hanging over your head.
But with the internet offering unlimited space and digital memorial pages becoming the central hub where people share photos, post comments, and light virtual candles, is the short-form paid newspaper obituary eventually going to become completely obsolete? I mean, why pay a newspaper when a website is free and infinite?
We are certainly seeing a massive shift, but the short-form print notice still serves a unique sociological function.
Really? How so?
Well, the online memorial page is an incredible resource, but it is a destination. It is usually visited by people who already know and love the person, who are actively seeking out that space to mourn.
Oh, that makes sense.
The local newspaper notice, however, is a broadcast. It reaches the wider peripheral community, the old neighbor from 20 years ago, the former coworker, the high school teacher, who wouldn't necessarily be searching online but still reads the local paper over coffee.
Right.
Furthermore, there's immense value in the actual constraint of a newspaper limit.
Value in the constraint. I would think the constraint is just an annoying financial burden.
It is a burden, but forcing yourself to distill a sprawling, complex life into its absolute most important essence is an incredible, clarifying exercise.
Okay, I see.
When you are staring at a strict word limit and you have to choose between mentioning their 30-year career at the bank or their obsessive love of community gardening because you only have 50 words left, it forces you to identify what truly mattered most about their existence.
Wow.
It distills the legacy.
The limitation forces clarity. I hadn't thought of it that way. Now, regarding distribution, the guide points out a stark modern reality. Social media is the new town square.
It really is.
A family member sharing a link to the memorial page on Facebook or Instagram is how the vast majority of people under 50 find out about a death today.
For sure.
The network effect of social media allows the news to reach those peripheral circles of friends in a way that print media simply can't match anymore.
It democratizes the distribution of the news and allows the community to instantly gather and share their own specific memories in the comments, which, adds to that larger human narrative we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And to help tie all of this architecture, craft, and logistics together, the guide mentions that Vigils actually provides a digital tool to help families through this entire process.
Which is so helpful.
It's an editor that allows the designated writer to draft, suggests structures based on various religious traditions if needed, and even exports a perfectly formatted, print-ready PDF for the newspaper. It basically acts as a structural safety net during a really difficult, foggy time.
Because by outsourcing the formatting and the rigid structural rules to a tool, it allows the grieving family to reserve their limited mental and emotional energy for what actually matters, remembering the specific details of the life lived.
So what does this all mean? We have explored the tension between the historical record and the human narrative. We've talked about the psychology of specific details, the danger of white noise cliches, navigating family drama by acting as a single voice, and the economics of word counts.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. But here's the thing I really want you to take away from this deep dive. At the very end of the guide, they provide a list of questions to help you start writing if you are staring at a blank page. Questions like, what did they teach you without meaning to? What did they do every day that defined them? What made them laugh?
Those prompts bypass the resume entirely and go straight to the heart of a person's character.
Yes. And even if you are not currently tasked with writing an obituary, and hopefully you are not, these are incredible questions to help generate material. But more than that, as I was reading them, I realized these are fantastic prompts for appreciating the people in your life right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
While they are still here, sitting across from you at the dinner table, don't wait until you have a strict deadline, a fog of grief, and a newspaper word limit to think about what the people you love teach you without meaning to.
That is a brilliant way to apply this framework to the present moment. And it brings up a compelling final thought.
Oh, let's hear it.
This entire guide highlights how a human life is often best remembered and most deeply felt not by the grand, sweeping achievements or the impressive job titles we spend so much time stressing over.
Right.
It is remembered by the hyper-specific, entirely mundane details, like the distinct way someone answered the phone, the specific garden they tended, or a chipped coffee mug they absolutely refuse to
The
replace.
single bright streak of color.
Exactly. So I will leave you with this. If you were to look around your own life right now, at your own daily rhythms and quirks, what is the totally mundane object, weird habit, or daily routine that would end up defining your obituary?